Welcome to Value Plays Only, where Ristic Study is just to help make land drops. Today, we have Tyler, playing Dargo the Shipwrecker and Tymna the Weaver. This deck looks to loop Dargo with Relic Legends or Burgi and a Sacrifice Outlet, or it can win with Underworld Breach. His hand contains a Magda, Brazen Outlaw, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Cabal Ritual, Praetor's Grasp, Marsh Flats, and Bloodstained Mire. His Luna Mulligan is a Mayhem Devil. John is playing Ghave, Guru of Spores. This walking combo pile goes infinite with any 3 cards in the deck. This deck usually wins with an Aristocrat-style loop or an Undying combo. His hand contains a Delighted Halfling, Enlightened Tutor, Mana Vault, Besagian Who Endures, Wooded Foothills, and Agadeem's Awakening. His Luna Mulligan is a Fyndhorn Elves. Dan is playing Najeela, the Blade Blossom. This 5-color good stuff pile is packed full of wins. In addition to Najeela-specific combos like Derevian Grim Hireling, it can win with Thassa's Oracle or Underworld Breach. His hand contains an Esper Sentinel, Orcish Bowmasters, Opposition Agent, Mystical Tutor, Intuition, Delighted Halfling, and Mana Confluence. Cammy is playing Winota, Joiner of Forces. This deck is packed to the brim with creatures. It looks to stack out the board while cheating in massive combat threats. Her hand contains a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Esper Sentinel, Ginger Brute, Rite of Flame, Pinnacle Monk, Plains, and an Ancient Tomb. And with that, let's see some value plays. Tyler starts things off with a Bloodstained Mire. He pays a life and cracks it, fetching up a Badlands. He casts a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He passes the turn. John plays a Wooded Foothills for turn. He pays a life and cracks it, fetching up a Savannah. John passes. Dan plays a Mana Confluence for turn. He takes one to cast Esper Sentinel. Dan passes the turn. Cammy plays a Plains for turn. She casts her own Esper Sentinel. Cammy passes the turn. Tyler untaps and plays a Marsh Flats. He goes to combat and swings Ragavan at John. John takes the damage. Ragavan triggers to make a treasure and exile Diabolic Intent off the top of John's library. John shakes his fist at one of the tutors he needs to make his hand work being gone forever. In his second main phase, Tyler pays a life and cracks his Marsh Flats, fetching up a Scrubland to the battlefield. He casts a Magda, Brazen Outlaw. Tyler passes the turn. In his end step, John casts an Enlightened Tutor, both Esper's trigger and Cammy and Dan draw. John puts a Smothering Tithe on top of his library. The turn then moves to John. John untaps and plays Agadeem the Undercrypt, into play untapped, losing 3 life. He casts Mana Vault, both Esper's trigger and Cammy and Dan draw. With some grumbling from Dan, Mana Vault resolves. John then casts Smothering Tithe. With a lot more grumbling from the table, Tithe resolves. John then passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. Dan plays a Thran Quarry for turn. He casts an Orcish Bowmasters. It enters and triggers, pinging Magda for 1, killing it. Dan passes the turn. Cammy untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. She plays an Ancient Tomb as land for turn. Cammy takes 2 to cast Soul Ring. Esper triggers and she pays. Cammy casts Ginger Brute. She then taps out for an Aethersworn Canonist. She then passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. Tyler plays an Emergent Zone as land for turn. He goes to combat and swings Ragavan at John. John takes 2 and Ragavan triggers. Tyler makes a treasure and exiles Survival of the Fittest from the top of John's library. With 2 tutors gone, John is feeling worse and worse about his top decks. In his second main phase, Tyler casts a Rakdos the Muscle. He then passes the turn. John untaps and takes 1 from his Mana Vault. He plays a Bloodstained Mire as land for turn. He pays a life and cracks it, fetching up a Bayou. He casts his commander, Ghave, Guru of Spores. Under Aethersworn Canonist, John passes. Dan untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. Dan plays a City of Traders as land for turn. He casts his commander, Najeela, the Blade Blossom. Dan passes the turn. Cammy untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and she takes 2 to pay. Cammy plays Bloodstained Mire as land for turn. She pays a life and cracks it, fetching up a Plateau. She casts her commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. Cammy moves to combat, swinging Ginger Brute at Dan. Winota triggers, looking at the top 6 and putting Thalia, Guardian of Thraben into play, tapped and attacking Dan. Dan blocks Ginger Brute with his Orc Army, and both die. Cammy then passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. Tyler casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He goes to combat and swings Ragavan at Dan, and Rakdos at John. They declare no blocks and take the damage. Ragavan triggers, making Tyler a treasure and exiling Spellskite off the top of Dan's library. At the start of his second main phase, Tymna triggers and Tyler pays 2 to draw 2. Tithe triggers twice and Bowmaster triggers twice. Dan and Tyler debate the best things to out with Bowmasters, while John says if they try to kill the Aethersworn Canonist, he'll put a 1/1 counter on it with Ghave. Bowmaster pings off Thalia and Esper Sentinel, and then John makes 2 treasures. Starting to fear Ghave, Tyler opts to exile Simian Spirit Guide from his hand and crack his last treasure for Spellskite. Tyler then passes the turn. John untaps and plays a Temple Garden for turn, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his own Aethersworn Canonist. John then passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. Dan casts a Noble Hierarch. With no good attacks, he has to pass the turn. Cammy untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and she pays. Cammy plays an Urza Saga as land for turn, getting its first counter. She dashes in a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. Cammy goes to combat and swings Ragavan at Dan. Winota triggers and Cammy puts a Mog Catcher into play, tapped and attacking Dan. Dan takes 4 and Ragavan triggers, making a treasure and exiling Tainted Pact off the top of Dan's library. Cammy then passes the turn, returning Ragavan to hand. Tyler untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. Tyler casts an Esper Sentinel. He then casts a Prize Statue. Esper triggers and Dan responds with a Mystical Tutor. Esper triggers and Dan pays. Mystical Tutor resolves and Dan searches up a Culling Ritual onto the top of his library. He then draws from Esper. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. Prize Statue then resolves and Tyler makes a treasure. Tyler then goes to combat and swings Rakdos at John. John takes the damage, and in his second main phase, Tymna triggers to lose a life and draw a card. Smothering Tithe and Bowmaster trigger. Dan pings Ghave for 1, and John makes a treasure. Tyler plays Blood Crypt for turn, into play on tap, paying 2 life. Tyler then sacrifices Esper, Prize Statue, Ragavan, and Spellskite as an additional cost to cast his other commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. This will mean Dan gets less mana off his Culling Ritual. Rakdos triggers 3 times, and Prize Statue triggers. Tyler makes a treasure and then exiles the top 4 cards of his library. Unfortunately, none of them can be cast under Aethersworn, and he has to pass the turn. In Tyler's end step, John activates Ghave's ability 4 times, removing 4 counters to create 4 1/1 Saprolings. Ghave then dies to state-based actions as he has 1 damage marked already. John untaps and takes 1 from his mana vault in his draw step. John recasts his commander, Ghave. It enters with 5 counters again. John then casts Phyrexian Altar. Esper triggers and John pays. John then passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. Dan casts Culling Ritual. In response, Tyler sacrifices both of his treasures for 2 mana, and John sacrifices treasures and creatures to altar to activate Ghave's ability, sacrificing his Saprolings and Aethersworn to add counters to Ghave. He ends up with a 7/7 Ghave and 2 floating mana. Then Culling Ritual resolves, and Dan adds 4 black and 3 green to his mana pool. Dan then casts Gamble. He searches up a card to hand and then randomly discards Mental Misstep. He spends 1 of his green for a Delighted Halfling. He then casts Opposition Agent. It resolves, and Dan spends another black on Vampiric Tutor. Vamp Tutor resolves, and Dan goes searching. As Dan's searching his library, John points out the Rakdos the Muscle on Tyler's board. They can just steal this top deck tutor, as Tyler may just win with it. Dan agrees not to put anything crazy on top. He searches up his card and puts it on top of his library, losing 2 life. Dan then passes the turn. Before leaving main phase, John spends his 2 floating mana to pull 2 Saprolings out of Ghave. The turn then moves to Cammy. Cammy untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. In her main phase, Urza's Saga gets a second counter. Cammy dashes in Ragavan. She then casts an Ocelot Pride. Cammy moves to combat and swings Ragavan and Mog Catcher at Dan. Winota triggers and Cammy puts a Drannith Magistrate into play, tapped and attacking Dan also. Dan blocks Ragavan with Delighted Halfling and takes the rest. With John celebrating that Tyler probably can't just win now, Cammy passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. Tyler swings Dargo at Cammy, Rakdos at John, and Tymna at Dan. The table begs for Dan to trade with the Tymna so Tyler won't get 3 draws. Dan declares no blocks. Everyone takes the damage, and in his second main phase, Tymna triggers and Tyler loses 3 to draw 3. Tithe triggers 3 times, and John makes 3 treasures. Tyler plays Gemstone Mine for turn. He casts a Burgi, God of Storytelling. Tyler then activates Rakdos, sacrificing Tymna. This triggers Rakdos to exile the top 3 cards of Dan's library. The table now see the card that Dan tutored up, Demonic Consultation. The table begged Dan to explain why he put this on top, knowing Tyler could take this and get any card to win. Dan says, I figured it wouldn't be that important. Tyler casts a Static Prison. Burgi triggers to make a red mana. The table know this will out the Drannith and just win the game with the free card that Dan gave him. In response, Dan casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling Thassa's Oracle as an additional cost. The table now understand exactly what he was going for, and his trust hits an all-time low. Dan assures the table they don't have to worry as he now has 1 card in hand. Static Prison is countered. Tyler then casts Reanimate, targeting Orcish Bowmaster. Tyler loses 2 life and Bowmaster enters, and it triggers to kill the Ocelot Pride. Tyler passes the turn. John untaps and casts Delighted Halfling. John passes, saddened by the Opposition Agent. Dan untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and he pays. Dan plays an Arid Mesa as land for turn. City Traders should sacrifice here, but the table missed it. They'll catch it later on. Dan pays a life and cracks Arid Mesa to fetch up a Tundra. Dan goes to combat and swings Najeela at Tyler. Najeela triggers to make a 1/1 warrior, tapped and attacking Tyler also. Tyler blocks the warrior with Burgi and takes 3. Dan then passes the turn. Cammy untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and Cammy pays. In our main phase, Urza's Saga gets its 3rd counter. In response to the trigger, Cammy takes 2 to make a construct. Urza's Saga then resolves, and Dan searches Cammy's library through Opposition Agent, putting a mana vault into exile. Cammy casts an Ornithopter and passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. He plays Cavernous Souls, naming Pirate as it enters. Tyler goes to cast Tymna and then is reminded of the Drannith Magistrate. Tyler accepts his fate as the combat deck now and goes to combat. He swings Dargo, Rakdos, and Bergie at Dan. Dan takes 16, and Tyler passes the turn. John untaps and plays a polluted Delta. With nothing good to do under Oppo, John passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and he pays. He plays a Badlands, his land for turn. He goes to combat, swinging Najeela at Tyler. Najeela triggers to make a warrior, tapped and attacking Tyler. Tyler blocks the warrior with his Orc army and takes 3. Dan passes the turn. Cammy untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and she pays. Cammy casts Rograk, son of Roga. She swings her Construct and Ornithopter at Tyler. Winota triggers twice. The first trigger puts Rionia, Fire Dancer, into play, tapped and attacking Dan. John cautions Cammy against killing Dan and unlocking Tyler. Tyler shows his hand of 2 lands and a Praetor's Grasp. It is at this point that the table tell him that Opposition Agent doesn't interact with Praetor's Grasp. Tyler curses the last 5 turns he did nothing. The second Winota trigger resolves, and Cammy puts Sanctum Prelate into play, tapped and attacking Tyler. Hearing what he has in hand, Cammy names 3 as it enters. Tyler falls into an even deeper despair. Neither Dan nor Tyler declare any blocks and take the damage. Cammy then passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John makes a treasure. He goes to combat. At this point, Dan notices his City Traders is still in play and he sacrifices it. He swings Rakdos, Dargo, and Bergie at Cammy. Cammy takes 16, going up to 14 commander damage, and Tyler passes the turn. John untaps and draws a card. Finally drawing a card that will get them out of this game, John casts Geralf's Messenger. After a quick explanation of how this card wins, no one has any response and it enters. John activates Ultra Dementia to sacrifice Geralf for a mana. Undying triggers to return Geralf to the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it. When it enters, Geralf triggers to ping Dan for 2. He uses the 1 mana to activate Ghave's ability, removing the counter from Geralf to create a 1/1 Saproling. He can then present a loop of sacrificing Geralf to altar over and over, removing the counter with Ghave each time it returns and pinging an opponent for 2. John pings down Dan, then Tyler, then Cammy. And with that, John wins the game. So, what do we learn today? If you give a combo deck 10 turns to draw into a combo piece, they might eventually just get there. If you have any tips for the video, leave them below. Subscribe if you feel like it. Until next time, keep making value plays.
Fuck you. I'm gonna go Vamp Tutor if that's good.
Dan, before you make your choice,
What?
I just want to tell you,
What?
Rakdos can exile your cards.
We can?
If you put Breach on top, Tyler will just win on his turn. Can I beg you to just put a bad card on now that we're here?
I won't put Breach on top.
Okay. Put some sick combo.
That's a good point, though.
You can just have it for free.
Let's switch it into something that is useless to me.
Good.
Big braining me, and he still
You put
put
the
something
tan pack.
super good on
Oh,
top.
is that-
and he
so?
just doesn't.
This
Doesn't
is
think
he
it's
really
something
put
good.
it down
Yeah,
now.
100%. I think it's really good. He thinks he got me.
Well, I have a draft.
My man. Tyler's back under the yoke.
Rakdos, Sack, Tymna. I'll look at your top 3, Dan.
Okay.
Put console? Brother. That's crazy.
Is that good for him?
It's anything he wants, yeah. It's a tutor that gets around Oppo. He literally will just get Alter and win right now.
I feel like
You just have Oppo, and you gave him the 1 card that gets around Oppo. It gets him anything he wants in his deck, based on what's in his hand.
That is true, knowing you were gonna have Oppo.
Yeah.
Why would
Yeah,
you not
that's-
give
I
yourself
gotta
a normal
pitch something?
tutor?
Yeah.
what do you mean? Oh, because I didn't want it.
Or Static Prison. I'll target Drannith.
Then I have 1 piece of interaction. It's not great.
That's really nice.
Yeah.
It's nice to be a
I'm-
helper.
Yay. I'm going to exile. Look at this, guys. That's his Oracle.
Wow.
And I'm going to.
Well, yeah.
He says I didn't want this.
That's fucking
Fuck
criminal.
you.
I told you he was
No,
greedy.
because
I
I
didn't-
didn't want to tutor.
I
It
told
was
you. You said
super
you didn't
obvious
want it.
when he
Oh,
said that.
okay.
that
I told
that-
you he was greedy.
All right.
I told you. It's crazy.
I paid
Dan,
one for you.
that's
All right.
crazy.
Dan,
Guys,
you've redeemed yourself.
I'm not the threat.
Yeah. How can we
Yeah,
ever
one
trust you?
card in hand.
I hate
Literally
you.
cannot
And it's
trust
Breach.
Dan.
No.
Unlocking any of his tutors. I'll
Yeah.
say
I
that.
literally just.
Yeah.
I have a Praetor's Grasp. I have to figure out what the hell everybody else plays.
You can
Why
Praetor's
do you
Grasp
want it
under
so
Oppo.
bad?
Huh?
Oppo just says you control your opponents while they're searching their libraries. He doesn't control you while you search my library.
I have literally.
It's a crazy
held this
interaction.
card for fucking 12 turns.
Sanctum Relay.
Unreal.
Yeah.
When it enters the battlefield, choose a number, non-creature spells.
Put it on 3.
Maybe
Praetor's
put it on
Grasp.
3.
That's fucked, guys. That's some meta
I know why you're
nonsense.
saying.
I was already gonna say 3, but
John, just to say, you could have a doubler or you could go infinite. It's
Yes.
still possible.
If I draw a doubler and then I draw a pinger, and I draw an undying creature, yes.
Geralf's Messenger? Is he like the good
He's a pinger
intercept-
and an undying. He's
Yeah.
the one that would need
Okay.
do 2 of those.
So
yeah.
it's possible.
This is the saddest game.
Wow. Can I show you my top deck? Geralf's Messenger.
Is that game?
I will.